That should stain our moral conscience, if nothing else does. Children do deserve our special protection and are entitled to it today. If we lean on the General Assembly's moral authority in other settings, we must also respect it in this one. Indeed, members of this Council have repeatedly expressed their concerns about the fraying of the international order. This Council, ignoring the expressed will of the majority of the world, may be what breaks it. Colleagues, we need a ceasefire now. As Foreign Minister Vieira said, we need to ensure that safe, sustained, and at-scale humanitarian aid reaches Gaza now, and that access to electricity, clean water, and fuel is restored now. The shutdown of cellular and internet services over the weekend as part of the offensive meant that wounded civilians were searching for help in the dark. As we have heard today, there have been over 76 attacks on healthcare, including 20 hospitals and clinics damaged or destroyed. More than 650,000 people are sheltering in UNRWA facilities. Let me be absolutely clear on this point. These sites are protected by international humanitarian law. Announcements that they are targets or warnings for them to evacuate do not, I repeat, do not alter their protected status. We need to see the rescission of dangerous, unrealistic evacuation orders. On Saturday, the Palestinian Red Crescent reported warnings from Israel to immediately evacuate Al-Quds Hospital, which hosts hundreds of patients, including newborn babies in incubators. Around 12,000 civilians are also seeking refuge there right now as we sit here in this chamber in New York, speaking to each other again and again and debating the language of our humanitarian resolution and response. An evacuation order in these conditions is cruel, it is reckless, and so is our delay as a Security Council. Mr. President, all of Gaza's civilian population is at risk by the escalating hostilities, as are the Israeli and international hostages taken by Hamas, wrongly taken by Hamas. While our eyes have been trained on Gaza, the occupied West Bank has not been spared from violence either. Israeli settlers are escalating their attacks against Palestinian civilians and forcing their displacement. These attacks must be prevented by the State of Israel. Across the region, there have been several credible warnings of a wider escalation. The drums of war are beating. Colleagues, taking these warnings seriously begins with stopping this war in Gaza. We do not serve Israel's security by enabling it to go on. We cannot reverse the heinous October 7th attacks by condoning this war in which civilians are paying the price. Ignoring what could happen day after day will have devastating consequences, not only for Israelis and Palestinians, but for the prospects of peace and stability in our region. Mr. President, as we work on responding to the General Assembly's clear call on this body to live up to its responsibilities under the UN Charter, we should also keep in mind, always, the dying words of the dead, so that their memories are a blessing to us. I'd like to speak today of an Arab poet, Heba Abu Neda, a Palestinian woman killed in Khan Yunis several days ago. My friend's circle diminishes, turning into little coffins scattered everywhere. As missiles launch, I can't grasp the fleeting moments with my friends. These aren't just names, they are reflections of us with a unique face and identity. Colleagues, we may have failed the dead, but we must channel our sorrow into saving the living. The time to reverse course is running out. What we and 121 countries are advocating for may be the harder road, but history warns us of the consequences of not taking it. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of China.
谢谢 主席先生，我首先感谢巴西根据阿联酋和中国的要求举行今天的会议。我也感谢拉扎里尼主任专员、罗素执行主任和刀敦女士刚才所做的通报。你们的通报再次反映出加沙局势的严峻性和安理会采取行动的紧迫性。
Last Friday, the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly adopted by an overwhelming majority a resolution calling for an immediate and durable humanitarian pause leading to a cessation of hostilities. This reflected the widespread call on the part of the international community. Regrettably and unacceptably, however, Israel, turning a deaf ear to the common concerns of the international community, has chosen to further escalate its military operations in Gaza and formally declared the launch of a ground assault. Secretary General Guterres has warned that the population in Gaza is facing a disaster of an avalanche proportion. Having one of the highest population density in the world, Gaza is a land that has been under blockade for 16 long years. The 2.3 million innocent people are living in utter fear amidst the indiscriminate bombardment and have been cut off from water, electricity, food, and fuel for 21 days. Just this past weekend, they experienced a communication blackout that lasted for nearly 36 hours. If left unchecked, the situation will spiral further out of control and an even greater humanitarian catastrophe will be inevitable. We express our deep sympathy to the people in Gaza who are struggling on the brink of life and death, and we are equally, if not more, deeply worried about the Middle East peace process, which is on the brink of collapse. China solemnly calls on the parties to the conflict to cease all hostilities, disengage immediately, set in place a humanitarian truce, and make every effort to prevent the situation from escalating further. China solemnly calls on Israel as the occupying power to fulfill its obligations under the international humanitarian law, lift its siege over Gaza, immediately rescind its evacuation order, and expeditiously restore the supply of basic necessities so as to prevent an even larger humanitarian disaster. China solemnly calls for intensified diplomatic efforts to facilitate the release of the hostages without delay and to work on this basis to seek to open up space for dialogue so as to return to the track of a political settlement. China solemnly calls on the power that has a special power on the parties concerned to put aside their own self-interests and geopolitical considerations and make every effort to stop the war and restore peace. Mr. President, the decades-long history of the Palestinian-Israel issue has taught us that military means are not the solution. Absolute security cannot be achieved by imposing collective punishment on civilians, and responding to violence with violence will only exacerbate hatred and confrontation. We call on the parties to the conflict to abandon their blind faith in the use of force and commit themselves to breaking the cycle of violence and achieving common security. There is no firewall in Gaza. It is a dangerous myth to think that a contained war is possible there. Allowing the fighting in Gaza to continue could very well turn it into a military catastrophe that will engulf the entire region. The situation in the West Bank and along the Lebanese-Israeli border has already sounded the alarm. We call on all parties concerned about the spillover of the conflict to devote their efforts towards promoting a ceasefire in Gaza. As long as the war rages, more violations of international humanitarian law are bound to happen. Without a comprehensive ceasefire, humanitarian assistance, no matter how much there is, will only be a drop in the ocean. What the people of Gaza need now is more than just a reiteration by the Council of the importance of international humanitarian law and the repetition of unfulfilled promises of protection. What they need is concrete actions to restore peace, uphold the law, the rule of law, and save lives. The Council has so far held several meetings on the situation of Palestine and Israel, and it cannot be said that there was no consensus at all. The resolution just adopted by the General Assembly has also pointed the Council in the right direction. In the face of the current critical situation, China once again solemnly calls on the Council to strengthen unity, build consensus, and take responsible and meaningful action as soon as possible. We believe that so long as we focus on the most pressing issues on hand, such as a ceasefire and an end to the fighting, the protection of civilians, and the prevention of a larger humanitarian disaster, it is possible for the members of this council to reach a consensus, and indeed, this is what they should do. At this juncture, silence means acquiesce, and inaction is tantamount to a green light. The eyes of the world are upon us, and history will record our choice. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to you and your teams for the courageous work done by you under the most difficult circumstances. Humanitarian actors have stepped up, as they always do, to try and save lives in the midst of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. This work is heroic, but tragically, it comes with great risk. We mourn the more than 60 UN staff who've been killed in Gaza since the start of this conflict. The lives of UN personnel must be protected. The lives of humanitarian workers must be protected. The lives of journalists must be protected. The lives of all civilians, innocent civilians, Israeli and Palestinians, men and women, children and elderly, must be protected. There's no hierarchy when it comes to protecting civilian lives. A civilian is a civilian is a civilian. Colleagues, it's been 3 weeks since Hamas killed more than 1,400 innocent civilians and took more than 200 people hostage. Gaza-based militants continue to fire barrages of rockets toward Israel. Citizens from dozens of member states are still being held hostage by Hamas. And the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is growing more dire by the day. At this moment of pain and sorrow and suffering, we must all come together. We must all come together to call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, address the immense humanitarian needs of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, affirm Israel's right to defend itself from terrorism, and remind all actors that international humanitarian law must be respected. That means Hamas must not use Palestinians as human shields, an act of unthinkable cruelty and a violation of the law of war, and that means Israel must take all possible precautions to avoid harm to civilians. Yesterday, President Biden spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu and reiterated that while Israel has the right and responsibility to defend its citizens from terrorism, it must do so in a manner consistent with international humanitarian law. The fact that Hamas operates within and under the cover of civilian areas creates an added burden for Israel, but it does not lessen its responsibility to distinguish between terrorists and innocent civilians. Colleagues, the United States is also deeply concerned by the significant uptick in violence against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. We condemn the killings of Palestinian civilians, and we urge Israel to prevent these attacks, working with the Palestinian Authority. The Biden administration also shares the international community's concern about telecommunications shutdowns in Gaza. We've made this clear to Israeli leaders, and we understand communication networks have started to be restored. This is essential. A shutdown of telecommunication imperils the lives of civilians, UN personnel, and humanitarian workers, and risks exacerbating the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Lives hang in the balance, and we must all step up, as the United States has done. We are the single largest donor to the Palestinian people, having contributed more than $1 billion to UNRWA since 2021. And President Biden recently announced an additional $100 million in humanitarian assistance for the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. But of course, no amount of aid will matter if it cannot reach people in need. And the United States continues to work with Israel, Egypt, the UN, and other partners to facilitate rapid and sustained assistance flow. Food, fuel, water, medicine, and other essential services must be restored. And while the number of trucks entering Gaza continues to increase, it is not nearly enough. The amount of humanitarian assistance flowing into Gaza must be scaled up urgently. We must do everything possible to save lives. And President Biden has expressed his support for humanitarian pauses in the fighting to allow hostages to get out, to allow humanitarian aid to reach Gaza and be distributed, and to allow safe passage for civilians, which will help people access humanitarian assistance or move to safer locations. We also continue to urge all member states to work to prevent any spillover of the crisis. Last week, Secretary Blinken asked this council to send a firm, united message to any state or non-state actor that is considering opening up another front against Israel, or who may target Israel's partners, including the United States. Don't. This is a matter of international peace and security, and this council must speak out. That is one of the many reasons that last week the United States put forward a strong and balanced Security Council resolution, one that we consulted with all member states on and we worked to forge consensus around. This resolution received the support of the majority of this council, but Russia and China blocked its adoption. Following this veto, action moved to the General Assembly, where member states were asked to vote for a resolution that was grossly one-sided and was missing two key words, Hamas and hostage. These are deliberate omissions that give cover and empower Hamas's brutality. During the emergency special session, we also heard a few member states implicitly endorse Hamas's acts of violence, and I was frankly shocked and appalled. It is outrageous and it must be called out. It is unconscionable that Hamas's actions are not condemned by the General Assembly. Colleagues, as I've said before, the United States will continue to engage with any council member, with any member state that is committed to adopting a strong and balanced resolution. But any council product must support direct diplomacy efforts that can save lives and advance the prospects of a more peaceful and secure future for the region. Even at this difficult moment, we must keep hope alive. We must work toward a brighter future, a future where Israelis and Palestinians have equal measures of security, freedom, justice, opportunity, and dignity, a future where Palestinians realize their legitimate right to self-determination and a state of their own, a future where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace. This is not the future Hamas wants to see, but it is the future that we must all work to advance together. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of the United States for her statement, And I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, to begin, I wish to thank Mr. Philippe Lazzarini and Ms. Lisa Dutton and Catherine Russell for their grave briefings this afternoon. I wish to thank them for all of the work of UNRWA, OCHA and UNICEF in such grueling circumstances, such as those being endured by these bodies on the ground. The events in Gaza are of grave concern, Mr. President. The situation of the civilian population is desperate. The aid that is arriving is insufficient. The future is uncertain and menacing. Telecommunication blackouts that have just been referred to and the beginning of ground operations are worsening this state of affairs. Ecuador values the efforts that have been made to render viable the entry of vital supplies from Egypt. We hope that we will ultimately manage to establish a system which makes it possible to supply the civilian population in a sufficient and continuous fashion. We recognize the right of countries to protect their civilians when international law allows. However, at the same time, we recall the obligation for that right to be exercised in full compliance at all times with international law and international humanitarian law, as we have stated on several occasions. As Ecuador and other members of the Council indeed have stated on several occasions. We support the work of the Secretary General, that of the United Nations system, and we support the work of its agencies who have the mandate to provide humanitarian aid to the population affected by this conflict. My country has appealed vehemently for the avoidance of the spillover of this violence to other areas in the region. At this moment, I wish to draw particular attention to the need to avoid exacerbating tensions and fueling the violence in the West Bank and on the border between Lebanon and Israel. I reiterate our request to all to act with a sense of responsibility and common sense. Anything else, and death, more pain and more suffering will be all that await. Mr. President, as I have said on several occasions in recent weeks, this Council must speak out in the face of the eruption of violence in the area and its dire humanitarian consequences. All efforts must be made to achieve this goal. Particularly, we must reach agreements between those who have the power to prevent, with their will alone, the adoption of a decision which enjoys the majority support of this Council. It is timely to recall here that exercising greater power brings with it greater responsibility. The Council must bear in mind that this organization was born to defend the dignity and worth of the human person, to ensure that reason prevailed in international relations, and to create a better world for all. It is our obligation, Mr. President, to strive so that we can always discharge that mandate. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Ecuador, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to thank you for the second time, chairing an emergency meeting of the Security Council on the situation in the Middle East this month. I would also like to thank the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, Director Lisa Doughton of OCHA, and the Executive Director of UNICEF, Catherine Russell, for their briefings and their efforts, and above all of their efforts in these particularly tragic circumstances. We offer our very sincere condolences to the UN, in particular to UNRWA, for the dozens of personnel who died in the course of their duties. Our condolences also go to the relatives of the thousands of Israeli and Palestinian civilians, more than a third of them children, who have lost their lives, tragically lost their lives in recent weeks. Since the 7th of October, Switzerland has strongly condemned the acts of terror, indiscriminate rocket fire against the Israeli population, and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas. In this context, Switzerland expressed its solidarity with the Israeli people. All hostages held in Gaza must be released immediately and unconditionally. We have recognized Israel's legitimate concern for national defense and security, recalling that the legitimate needs of security and military necessity are taken into account by international humanitarian law, which must be respected by all parties to the conflict. We stress once again the binding nature of all its rules, without exception, in particular the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the conduct of hostilities. All violations of international law must be investigated so that the perpetrators can be brought to justice. As it has done on many occasions, Switzerland reiterates that the application of international humanitarian law and human rights, in particular the protection of civilians, is and must remain a priority for this Council. It is therefore imperative to protect civilians and people who are no longer taking part in hostilities. We must protect them from acts of terror in Israel, and we must protect them in Gaza and the West Bank, where the increase in violence, particularly by settlers, is worrying. We must exert our influence on the parties to the conflict to ensure that international humanitarian law is respected, to halt the current spiral of violence and prevent it from spreading throughout the region. As we have heard, in Gaza, the entire population, almost half of whom are children, is now under siege entirely. Civilian infrastructure, including UNRWA schools and, in particular, hospitals, are protected by international humanitarian law. They must be able to provide security and assistance to civilians. The population must have access in sufficient quality and quantity to essential goods and services, including drinking water, food, medical care, and fuel. Switzerland has been working very actively within this Council and at the General Assembly for the respect for international humanitarian law and the introduction of measures such as humanitarian pauses or truces to guarantee access to aid. Such measures, accompanied by security guarantees, are necessary to enable the personnel of impartial humanitarian organizations to work effectively to respond to the needs of the population and to alleviate the worsening sanitary crisis in Gaza. This is all the more necessary in the light of the intensification of hostilities in recent days. Mr. President, unified action by this Council is therefore more necessary than ever to put an end to the violence, ensure respect for international law, and work towards peace. Switzerland will continue to make every effort to seek such action by this Council so that it assumes its responsibility in the face of this crisis. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Switzerland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini, the Executive Director Catherine Russell, and OCHA Director Lisa Ducton for their briefings on the current situation in Gaza. I am quite frankly shocked to the core by their briefings and accounts. I wish to thank the United Arab Emirates and China for convening this emergency open briefing, because we cannot, as a Security Council, remain unmoved in the face of the unbearable extent of the horror playing out before our eyes. The intensification of Israel's airstrikes, together with the ground operations of forces in Gaza, is causing the huge death toll of this war to tragically skyrocket. This is a heinous war which is morally unacceptable. The paralysis of this council is unacceptable and inconceivable. 10,000 people, including 1,000 children, have been killed since the heinous attacks of Hamas in Israel on the 7th of October. It is high time for this bloodbath to cease. Gabon, once again, staunchly condemns all deadly, indiscriminate violence. We wish to say the following very clearly indeed. Civilian populations must be neither currency nor
human shields, nor must they be the target of collective punishment. All hostages must be released unconditionally, and Israel's right to self-defense must be exercised in accordance with international humanitarian law and with the principles of proportionality, precaution, and distinction. The dehumanizing cycle of violence against civilian populations must immediately stop. Within this council, we must move beyond the bonds of the political and geopolitical bonds that bind us to inaction. We must move beyond divisions, rivalry, and sterility to call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for unhindered humanitarian access to those in need, those civilians trapped in the devastated ruins of Gaza. We call for the compliance with and implementation of the resolution adopted by the General Assembly on the 26th of October 2023. We hail the efforts to restore calm undertaken by the countries in the region. At the same time, we reiterate the Secretary General's appeal for a humanitarian ceasefire. We reiterate our appeal for restraint and encourage all states that have influence that they can bring to bear on parties to ratchet up efforts to bring parties to choose peace and to preserve human life. Mr. President, we are all aware of the risk that the Israel-Palestine conflict poses to peace and stability in the region as a whole and beyond. We must avoid a conflagration which would stand as a point of no return and would lead us into chaos once and for all. To conclude, I wish to reaffirm my country's conviction that diplomacy, dialogue, and negotiation, with a central role played by the United Nations, are and remain vital channels to achieve a lasting solution to this deadly crisis. We reiterate our commitment to the two-state solution. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Gabon for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I thank today's briefers, for their stark briefings, and also thank and applaud your teams for your important work on the ground. Commissioner General Lazzarini, we convey our sincere condolences for the tragic loss of UNRWA staff in these past weeks. For years, the agency has been an important stabilizing force in the region. In recent days, your work has been nothing short of heroic, and you can count on our full support. President, Malta is gravely concerned by the desperate situation in Gaza. Such military operations will undoubtedly have a devastating impact on the more than 2 million civilians trapped in the enclave. Let us not forget that these civilians were already perilously vulnerable and living in dire conditions. During these last days, thousands broke into UNRWA warehouses and distribution centers, taking wheat, flour, and other basic items. This illustrates how desperate the situation on the ground is, and is a worrying sign that civil order is starting to break down. In parallel, Hamas continues rocket barrage into Israeli territory, with some reaching Tel Aviv. This is completely unacceptable. We unequivocally reject and condemn these barbaric attacks, including the 7th October attack and the taking of hostages. These are heinous acts of terrorism. We reiterate our call on Hamas to immediately release all hostages safely and unconditionally, and urge parties with influence to continue negotiations to this end. Malta condemns all violence against civilians. All parties to the conflict are obligated to abide by international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. They must take all feasible precautions to avoid, and in any event minimize, harm to civilians and civilian objects. These including objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. We are utterly devastated to note the effects the conflict is having on Palestinian and Israeli children. Thousands have perished, while the rest are suffering unthinkable psychological traumas. We underscore that the killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools, hospitals, places of worship, and denial of children's access to humanitarian assistance are all grave violations. We also echo the concerns raised regarding the children being held by Hamas. We reiterate our call for their immediate release and for their special protection needs to be prioritized. President, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza can no longer be ignored. Urgent action is needed. This is why we voted in favor of the General Assembly resolution last Friday at the 10th Emergency Special Session. We welcome the provisions of this resolution calling for an immediate, durable and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. This is the minimum requirement to ensure protection of civilians. Meanwhile, we remain concerned that this Council has been unable to act in the face of this accelerating crisis. We echo the Secretary-General's message that this is a moment of truth. Our immediate priority must be to address the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe and to reverse current escalations. We urge Council members to unite in good faith and act decisively for the sake of regional and international security. We also stress that it is unacceptable that humanitarian actors working through the most life-threatening and extraordinary conditions to protect Gazan civilians also must contend with communications blackouts. Connectivity is of utmost importance, not only to the civilian population, but also so that aid responders can continue doing their critical work. Malta reiterates the call also made in the European Council conclusions for the continued, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access in Gaza, including through humanitarian corridors and pauses. All efforts made by international actors in this regard are welcome. Furthermore, we are alarmed at the precarious developments in areas outside of Gaza. It is critical that the international community works together to prevent a spillover which would further increase internal tensions and destabilize the entire region. Malta underscores that any lasting and sustainable plan for peace in the Middle East must be based on a two-state solution, in line with relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. De-escalation, restraint, and mediation are critical. The longer we fail to address these imperatives, the harder it will become to climb out of the abyss and towards the path of peace. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I thank the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Executive Director of UNICEF, and the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs for their briefings. The terrorist attacks by Hamas and other groups against Israel on the 7th of October have triggered an unprecedented crisis. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is tragic. Civilians are dying every day, including many children. The population is going hungry. The lack of water brings with it the risk of epidemics, and hospitals are overwhelmed. It is urgent that unfettered humanitarian access be guaranteed for the Gaza Strip that needs food, water, and electricity. The number of convoys must increase significantly in order to be commensurate with what is needed. A humanitarian truce is needed, which could ultimately lead to a ceasefire. France has significantly increased its humanitarian assistance through the chartering of a special flight last weekend and welcomes the commitment of the Secretary-General, the work of UN agencies, and the work of humanitarian actors on the ground, who are working in extremely difficult conditions. Our most sincere condolences go to the United Nations following the deaths of 63 UNRWA staff members. Civilians must be able to leave Gaza without being impeded from doing so, and we have constantly requested that for our own nationals and their families since the 7th of October. Nothing can justify the suffering of civilians who must be protected. All victims deserve our compassion, and all lives are valuable. Israel has the right to defend itself and the duty to do so in compliance with international humanitarian law, sparing the civilian population. France voted in favor of the resolution introduced by Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, which calls for a truce and humanitarian access and for the protection of civilians, which condemns terrorist acts and which calls for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. And I recall our condemnation in the most energetic terms of the terrorist attacks by Hamas, which in no way represents the Palestinians and which has nothing but contempt for their suffering. I also reiterate our call for the hostages to be released immediately and without condition. Following this vote in the General Assembly, this Council must be able to fully shoulder its responsibilities and achieve a just decision based on our common principles. France will continue to work on the new draft resolution presented by Brazil so that it can be adopted quickly. Mr. President, the extreme severity of the situation in Gaza should not lead us to forget what is happening in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. France firmly condemns the violence perpetrated by settlers against the Palestinian population, acts of violence which are increasing in the West Bank. We call on the Israeli authorities to put a stop to this. We must prevent this engulfing the entire region. France remains extremely worried following a launching of a shell that landed in UNIFIL headquarters in the south of Lebanon on the 28th of October. France is committed to avoiding a spread of this conflict. This war has reminded us, as if any reminder were necessary, that the world can no longer ignore the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace and security. We all are aware of the conditions for this, namely the necessary security guarantees for Israel and a state for the Palestinians. We must all mobilize in order to restore a political horizon. The only viable solution is a two-state solution, and France will continue its engagement within this Council for it to adopt a resolution as quickly as possible. We owe this to the Israelis and the Palestinians. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me thank Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Ms. Dutton for the information provided. We pay tribute to you, your work and your teams on the ground, and mourn the loss of over 60 UN workers fallen in the line of duty. The past 3 weeks have been dramatic for Israelis and Palestinians and tormenting for the Middle East and many elsewhere. The overall death toll in civilian victims is frightening and unsustainable. We extend our condolences and deepest sympathy to the families of all victims, Israelis and Palestinians alike. Mr. President, 7th of October will remain a defining moment in the never-quiet history of the Middle East. Hamas, its brutality and terror, the worst in human behavior, will not and must not be forgotten. In the current utterly complex situation, there is an accumulation of competing urgencies: the response to terror and the continued rocket launches from Gaza, the liberation of hostages, the protection of civilians, the provision of humanitarian help, and the increased risk of spillover of the conflict. Let me quickly go through each of them. First, in its exercise of the right of self-defense, which we recognize and support like for every other country under attack, Israel is determined to eradicate Hamas. It should not be portrayed mistakenly as a license to punish Palestinians. It is beyond any doubt that conducting warfare in such a densely populated area as Gaza is difficult, challenging, very demanding, and it must be conducted prudently, professionally, and in compliance with international humanitarian law. We profoundly regret every innocent life lost without distinction. While circumstances may be different, a loss is always a loss. Therefore, there is need for maximum precaution not to harm those who are twice in danger. First, from Hamas and their policies on one hand, and a fight they have not chosen on the other. It is therefore extremely important and urgent to do everything possible that civilian populations are not found in that hopeless place from where there is no escape. Second, Nothing can ever justify abducting and holding hostages innocent people, children, women, and elderly. Even less so using them, as Hamas is doing. They must be liberated, they must be brought home. We welcome efforts from various actors in this respect and urge them to continue. Third, unhindered humanitarian help at scale must be urgently provided to all those in need. We cannot contemplate children dying in the hospitals because of the lack of medicine or electricity or water or lack of communications. We cannot contemplate lack of food for entire families, adding to an already difficult situation the total breakdown of law and order because of lack of basic commodities. The government of Israel has promised that soon aid will flow in abundance. It should happen immediately. Those who are spared from the fighting do not need to die from hunger. Colleagues, we try to put ourselves in Israel's shoes, feel the trauma of terror striking with a ferocity we cannot forget, faced with an existential question with countries and proxies that seek openly to destroy it. I don't think anyone here or anywhere would feel at ease knowing that your next-door neighbor is just waiting for the right moment to kill you. How can this not bring back horrible memories? That fear and anxiety summarized in the Never Again pledge. But we also put ourselves in the very same way, in the shoes of the Palestinians, feeling the unexplainable pain of civilians caught in the midst of a war that has befallen on them, a war first imposed by Hamas and the likes, decided elsewhere by their masters who are rubbing their hands in the face of casualties they had anticipated and hoped for in a turmoil of all dangers. We feel for Palestinians who for decades, at every time they neared to the horizon of their future with their state, those against would always be quicker to disrupt it and push it further away. We feel for those thousands on both sides of this terrible divide who have lost their loved ones, the families of the hostages, and all those torn apart by death and grief and the insecurity of tomorrow. Wars are sometimes unavoidable because imposed, but they are always brutal. They bring inevitable destruction. They cause victims and sadly often casualties among those who don't deserve it. But even wars have laws and they must be respected. We believe and trust that there is a way, there is and must be a way to ensure the security of Israel and its people while ensuring the security of and the perspective of all Palestinians who do not want war. Colleagues, beyond the tragedy unfolding in Israel and Gaza, the magnitude of the human suffering is impacting people across borders and identities, and we notice a sharp increase in the hate and division, including the threat of terrorism and targeted violence. This sharp and often confusing polarization fails to acknowledge our common humanity, and that the killing of innocent civilians, regardless of religion or ethnic background, is wrong, unacceptable. The frightening images of the bloodthirsty mob yesterday in Dagestan hunting for Jewish people is another appalling illustration of intolerable and appalling rise of anti-Semitism. No one should stay indifferent to allow rallies where people chant "kill the Jews" or "destroy Israel." This is why there is so much need for wisdom, responsibility, and action on the ground and from this Council, because otherwise confusion, hatred, tension, and violence will continue, not only in Gaza and the West Bank, but also elsewhere in the Middle East and beyond, dividing societies, fueled by strong emotions, ideologies, and beliefs, overpowering cold minds and reason, and overshadowing forward-looking perspectives. Last but not least, Mr. President, the serious risk of spillover. Hezbollah is playing with fire, and attacks from the northern border are becoming more and more threatening. If this continues, it may be a matter of time before the irreparable point is reached. It must be resisted, since it will only bring the region and all the countries involved near a catastrophe. In this respect, we are also very concerned for the situation in the West Bank. We condemn the extremist settler violence on Palestinians, which is totally unacceptable. Such acts must be fully investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. Mr. President, in the face of so much complexity and adversity, we think it is urgent to start thinking about the Gaza of tomorrow, the Gaza without Hamas, without extremists. There is need to offer Palestinian civilians in Gaza a perspective, a new organization of life under a new administration. Hamas has let them down. Hamas has brought war to them. Hamas did not bring them prosperity because it invested in tunnels and rockets, in hatred and death. We need to start thinking how the fabric of the society can be repaired so that the children know that what shalom means instead of being raised with and repeating death to the Jews. If not, the Hamas of today will only be replaced by the Hamas of tomorrow, maybe with another name, but with the same hatred, the same ideology, the same goals embroiled in a never-ending cycle of hurting the other, acting falsely in the name of God they disrespect, and acting falsely in the name of a future they simply oppose. This is why there is a need to revive the political process as soon as possible, because in its absence there will only be unhappiness, poverty, discrimination, hatred, tension, never-ending violence, victims, and as it has happened many times, exploitation by terrorist extremists and their supporters. And let's not fool ourselves. The next war will be only deadlier. But it is preventable if we all work together with conviction and in good faith for peace, for lasting peace. And I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Albania and for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mozambique thanks the Brazilian presidents for timely convening this meeting. We also thank the briefers, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of United Nations Relief and the Workers' Agency for Palestine Refugees in East, Ms. Lisa Dothen, OSHA's Director of Humanitarian, Financial and Resource Mobilization Division, and Mrs. Catherine Russell, Executive Director of United Nations Children Fund, for their insight and update on the current situation in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, a glue and tragic situation is taking place in Gaza. We are horrified by reports of suffering and death of children, women, and men in Gaza. It is clear that the protection of civilians in time of war is not being observed. In this context, Mozambique joins our voice with that of many others in reiterating an immediate and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire to ease the suffering of millions of our brothers and sisters, Israelis and Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, we should remind ourselves that the laws of war have established the clear rules to protect human lives, human dignity, and respect humanitarian needs. These laws cannot augment or sidelined under any circumstances. They must be respected and observed by everyone, everywhere, at all times, without exception or excuse. We have condemned attacks on Hamas on 7 October against the Israeli children, women, and men. We strongly condemn the attacks against the civilian populations, in particular children, women, elderly, and the UN humanitarian staff. We call on their protection. That is vital. It is therefore imperative that we continue working together towards ensuring the safety and protections of civilians in the conflict zones. The world looks at us as expertise as a member of this Security Council to respond expeditiously to the situation in the Gaza Strip. The United Nations awaits actions and leadership from this Council. Article 24 of the UN Charter clearly states that, I quote, in order to ensure prompt and effective action by United Nations, its members confer on the Security Council primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security, end of the quote. Accordingly, we reiterate our appeal to members of this Council to fulfill their functions and powers, to change the course of actions in the Gaza Strip. Mozambique, as a strong advocate for peace and dialogue in the Middle East region, particularly in Palestine, we echo the United Secretary General repeated calls towards resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is the key to sustainable peace in the Middle East. For this desirable purpose, we firmly believe that the parties can work together through constructive dialogue for a lasting peace in full compliance with the principles of two-state solution based on Security Council and General Assembly resolutions and decisions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of Mozambique, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, distinguished Mr. Minister, we fully support the convening by the delegations of the UAE and China of this emergency meeting of the Security Council on the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. We were extremely concerned to hear the assessments of the situation on the ground from the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell, and OCHA Director Lisa Doughton. Colleagues, the time has come to call things by their names. On the occupied Palestinian territory, the west bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip, a humanitarian catastrophe of biblical proportions is unfolding. According to incoming information, the number of people killed in the enclave has exceeded 8,000, half of which are children, women, and older persons. More than 2,000 people are buried under the rubble, half of which are also children. More than 21,000 people have been wounded. The number of internally displaced persons in Gaza has reached 1.6 million people. In UNRWA camps alone, there are 640,000 Palestinians. In the West Bank, more than 100 people have been killed and 3,000 have been injured. These chilling numbers are growing by the hour. We express our gratitude to all humanitarian workers on the ground that are working to exhaustion with a catastrophic lack of basic, including medical supplies, and also with an extremely high risk to their own lives. The scale of losses from UN agencies is shocking. 63 staff members have been killed, 22 have been injured, and 42 UNRWA objects have been destroyed. And we pay tribute to the UN staff that continue to work in unimaginable conditions and to those that have paid for this with their lives. According to media reports, during Israeli shelling on the Blue Line, 2 peacekeepers from the UN Interim Force in Lebanon have been wounded. The largest hospital in Gaza, Al-Quds, is under the threat of attack from the IDF. The Israeli Air Force is launching strikes 50 meters from facilities, demanding immediate evacuation. Almost 640,000 IDPs have found refuge in 150 UNRWA sites across the Gaza Strip. As a result of the bombing, 9 hospitals are entirely unusable, and the remaining ones are experiencing an acute lack of medicines. The blockade of the Gaza Strip has essentially become total. In the enclave, internet and mobile service has been switched off. It has been quite simply cut off from the rest of the world. Nobody knows accurately what is exactly happening there. This sort of blockade not only is sowing greater panic among the civilian population, it is directly undermining the work of medical and rescue services, which means it is leading to more civilian casualties. For this reason, it was not possible to agree on the 28th of October for the passage of another humanitarian convoy across the Rafah crossing point. We categorically condemn these actions, particularly in a situation in which, after shutting off communications, the most powerful airstrikes were launched on the enclave since the beginning of this escalation. In the conditions of active hostilities, the humanitarian response remains essentially nominal. Through the Rafah crossing point, the only point from Egypt, since the 21st of October, only 94 trucks have made it through, and according to incoming information, Israel is even stymieing these meager deliveries. As a result, in the Gaza Strip, there is an acute lack of everything: water, fuel, food, medicines, and people are frightened and have been driven to despair. On the 28th of October, upon the decision of the military political leadership of Israel, the armed forces of that country, ignoring the position clearly expressed by the international community in the UN General Assembly resolution adopted the previous day, began a ground operation in the Gaza Strip. After extremely intensive airstrikes, the Israeli army began to enter the territory of the enclave from several directions: in the south near Bureij refugee camp and Khan Yunis, and in the north near Beit Hanun. Colleagues, the Israeli authorities have different ways of describing their actions: expanding operations or preparing a bridgehead. But that's not the point. The point is that despite the unambiguous reaction around the world, West Jerusalem has begun the practical implementation of its plans to clear the enclave. In response, we have heard from the head of the Israeli Foreign Ministry saying that Israel rejects outright the UN's despicable call for a ceasefire. End quote. These comments did not go unnoticed as well, the comments from the permanent representative of Israel saying that the UN has lost its legitimacy. There are shocking statements from a number of representatives in the Knesset that have been broadly circulated in the media saying that, and I quote, there is no symmetry in the Israeli response, and that, and I quote, the children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves, end quote. Unfortunately, this clearly shows that Israel is demonstratively ignoring the opinion of the overwhelming majority of UN members, including many Western states, regarding the need for an end to the violence. This appalling situation has also been brought about because, due to the US position, the Security Council has essentially been paralyzed and has still not been able to adopt a resolution with an immediate demand for a ceasefire. We have twice made attempts to do so, but Washington and Western Jerusalem have entirely other plans: to wipe out the population of Gaza, or to force them out of the Gaza Strip, and to force the remaining Palestinian population to assimilate into Israel so as to resolve the Palestinian problem that way. In the context of the unprecedented scale of the escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we also have to note the current rise in tensions on the Syrian-Israeli border, which is linked to the active external interference coupled with the illegal military presence of the USA in the north and northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic. On the 26th of October, US forces, upon the instructions of President Joe Biden, launched strikes on two objects in the Abu Kamal area in the east of Syria. Washington said that the attack was undertaken in exercise of their so-called right to self-defense, American style. And this is thousands of kilometers from US territory. These illegitimate and in no way justified actions by Washington are nothing other than a gross violation of Syria's sovereignty and the norms of international law. In the present circumstances, such an illegitimate use of force could have extremely dangerous consequences because it could provoke an armed escalation encompassing the entire region. Colleagues, the time for half measures and half-hearted glib appeals is past. No humanitarian pauses will help. Humanitarian assistance cannot be provided in the height of hostilities on the ground. I hope that everyone here understands that. The number of victims among the humanitarian workers is running into the dozens. Ambulances have been bombed, and those that are left are unable to operate due to a lack of fuel. All noble humanitarian passages are, of course, important, but in and of themselves, they are not going to stop the war. The priority of the global community now is to stop the bloodshed, to minimize the harm to the civilian population, and to move the situation into the political diplomatic sphere. There must be a consolidation of collective efforts aimed at relaunching a fully fledged negotiating process between Israelis and Palestinians, with the aim of realizing the UN-endorsed two-state solution. Upon the basis of that, an independent Palestinian state should be created in the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Mr. President, I would like to ask the permanent representative of the USA a question. Can you explain why you oppose a ceasefire? Does this mean that the USA, as a permanent member of the Security Council, supports the doctrine of a massive retaliation in Gaza? Where is your compassion for civilians that you so eloquently express at every Security Council meeting on Ukraine? And that's even though the lives of civilians in Ukraine are far from facing the same level of threat as Palestinians in Gaza. Or is it that you only think about those who are in the European continent and that Palestinian lives don't stir any emotions in Washington? And I would like to put the same question to the other Western delegations in the Council, who shamefully abstained on all of our draft resolutions calling for a ceasefire. Colleagues, your double standards are more than evident. The populations of your own countries are now calling for an answer to that, where there are mass demonstrations in support of Palestine. In this situation, the Russian Federation is making intensive efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground, aimed at rapidly resolving the crisis. We have sent a clear signal to all of the parties involved. There must immediately be an end to the fighting and the ensuring of humanitarian corridors for the emergency provision of assistance to all those who need it. And President Putin has been extremely clear. We categorically will not accept and condemn any terrorist acts. We express condolences to all those who have lost their loved ones in Israel and in Palestine and in other countries. But while condemning terrorism and the taking of hostages and demanding their unconditional release, we categorically cannot agree that the threat of terrorism can be responded to while violating the norms of international humanitarian law, including the indiscriminate use of force on objects of civilian infrastructure where civilians are known to be located, and alongside addressing the urgent tasks to end the current escalation of violence, we must immediately begin to agree on a strategy for collective actions for a political settlement to the conflict. In the past, this was done by the quartet of international mediators. However, the USA has done everything to undermine this effective instrument. On the agenda is establishing a collective mediating mechanism with an active role for states in the region. This is supported by the positive trends that before the previous escalation, the current escalation in Gaza, were evident in the Middle East. The Saudi-Iranian normalization, the reintegration of Syria into the League of Arab States, and the steady improvement in interstate relations between Syria and Turkey. All of this proves, all of this proves that the countries in the region are, when they take the situation in hand, and are not subjected to pressure from outside the region, they can achieve a great deal to stabilize the Middle East. Given the growing escalation in the Palestinian enclave and the unthinkably vast consequences for the civilian population, which is cut off from outside supplies, we believe it is important to hold regular open briefings such as the one today. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, without any discrimination, must remain within the focus of our constant attention as takes place in the context of other crises. Mr. President, some to shift the focus from the tragic events surrounding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict touched upon the 29th of October incident in Makhachkala airport in Dagestan in Russia. Exhaustive comments on this have already been provided by the Russian leadership and representatives of the regional authorities and the Muslim leadership. Assessing the actions will be provided by the Investigative Committee of Russia, which has launched criminal cases into this disorder. Dozens of people participating in this disorder have already been arrested and questioned. It's clear that any illegal actions are unacceptable. However, attempts to paint an unsanctioned action in the airport as an outbreak of anti-Semitic feeling in Russian society, particularly in the North Caucasus, is unacceptable. This region has long been an example of the peaceful and friendly coexistence of those from many different peoples. In Russian society, unlike Western societies, the principles of tolerance and religious and racial grounds are well-rooted. In our society, there is the coexistence of the representatives of all of the main faiths: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. As is confirmed by data from the Russian security services, the events in Makhachkala are clearly clearly show signs of external interference, including information interference through social networks. And the traces of that, you will be not surprised at all, come from Ukraine. Some wish to abuse the situation and play on the feelings of Muslims in Russia by showing terrible pictures from the Gaza Strip, showing the horrors that are taking place there, the deaths of women, older persons, children, and medical workers. I would recommend that some of our colleagues do not try to shift the blame, but rather that they pay attention to the situation in their own capitals, where there are many Muslim demonstrations that are being brutally put down by the police. This is an example of Western countries' commitment to multiculturalism and freedom of expression. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton for your stark and clear briefings. Let me start by recognizing the courage, commitment, and sacrifice of UN employees and humanitarian workers in Gaza, and in particular, the 103 aid workers, including the 64 UNRWA staff who have been killed in Gaza in the last 22 days. We also offer our sincere condolences to all Palestinians and Israelis who have suffered or lost loved ones. Since Hamas' terrorist attack against Israel on the 7th of October, the United Kingdom has underscored Israel's right to self-defense against terrorism. We continue to be clear that this must be done in accordance with international humanitarian law. Our efforts with our international partners have focused on the protection of civilians, securing and scaling up humanitarian access, and the release of hostages. Sadly, despite these efforts, the situation in Gaza deteriorates daily. Hamas bears sole responsibility for starting this conflict. President, I'd like to highlight 3 priorities. First, we call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law, including the principles of proportionality, distinction, and necessity. This requires all parties to take every possible step to avoid the harming of civilians and the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. Second, we must urgently cooperate to scale up aid into Gaza and to ensure sufficient access points are open. For this to happen successfully, there needs to be a safer environment, which necessitates humanitarian pauses. We support UN-led efforts in this regard. Since the latest escalation in Gaza, the UK has committed over $36 million in additional aid to the occupied Palestinian territories. An RAF flight arrived in Egypt on the 25th of October, carrying 21 tons of UK aid for Gaza. But the access environment needs to improve immediately so that these and other life-saving resources can reach the people who desperately need them. Third, we cannot allow this conflict to spread. We call on all countries in the region to help avoid escalation and warn non-state actors not to exploit the current situation. President, the Palestinian Authority has a key role as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. We call on Israel and other states to support the PA. We call on Israeli authorities to tackle the rising number of settler attacks and killings in the occupied West Bank, recalling that it is their responsibility to protect Palestinian civilians there. The UK retains the long-term goal of a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine coexisting peacefully. To reach that goal, we have a responsibility to ensure a plan for Gaza that offers the population hope, security, stability, prosperity, and effective governance so that their political wishes can be fulfilled. In this regard, some fundamental principles apply. There should be no mass displacement of Gazans to neighbouring countries. The Palestinian Authority should play a central role, and nothing should be done that cuts across progress towards a two-state solution, with Gaza as an integral part of a Palestinian state. Thank you, President.
I thank the permanent representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Japan.
I thank Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini and UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell and OCHA Director Lisa Doughton for your briefings. I join other colleagues in expressing our respect to all humanitarian actors who are tirelessly working under unimaginable conditions. Mr. President, since October 7th, thousands of people have been killed and wounded. The tragic sequence of events shows no signs of abating, descending further into a devastating cycle with unimaginable losses of life and the destruction of civilian facilities. Just recently, Israel announced the expansion of its ground operations in Gaza. Japan has been paying careful attention to the situation with grave concern. Japan has expressed unequivocal condemnation to the terror attacks committed by Hamas and other militants and extends its sincere condolences to all victims. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages. The international community should never tolerate such a heinous act. Hamas does not speak for the Palestinian people. Every member state has the right to defend itself and its people in accordance with international law. At the same time, all parties must act based on international law. The deterioration of the situation in Gaza has led to a deepened humanitarian crisis to an unprecedented level of severity. The loss of any more innocent lives, regardless of their nationalities, religions, or ethnicities, is simply unacceptable. No one's life is more important or less important than that of others. Full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, consistent with international humanitarian law, must be allowed in order to alleviate the devastating humanitarian situation. While several trucks have crossed through the Rafah crossing, hundreds more must follow suit to meet the dire need of over 2 million people. And in this context, we should also take further steps immediately, including humanitarian pauses and establishment of humanitarian corridors. Additionally, we express our profound concern regarding the disconnection of telecommunications networks, which disrupts vital communication channels between those in Gaza and the rest of the world, and also impedes the work of media and humanitarian communities. It is especially imperative to ensure these networks function to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance and the safety of humanitarian workers. As the situation is rapidly evolving, it is critical for all parties in the region to avoid exacerbating this conflict. The international community has a duty to redouble its diplomatic efforts in order to prevent the instability from spilling over into the region and to calm the situation with a sense of urgency. The Security Council needs to act urgently to find a common ground among all Council members to deliver a meaningful message and help to all parties, to all in distress. While we remain unable to act, lives are being lost day by day, minute by minute. We must also recall that ultimately there is no alternative to a two-state solution. All parties must make serious efforts to this end. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Japan for his statement, and I give the floor to the permanent representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, I thank you for giving me the floor. And let me begin by thanking Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton for their briefings on the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza following the resurgence of conflict in the Middle East after the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel on 7th of October. 23 days after the attacks in southern Israel, with the attendant loss of lives and abductions, we are appalled by the many lives that are being lost in the ensuing conflict, as well as its humanitarian consequences. We are equally concerned by the potential spread of the conflict to the wider region and the heavy toll that it bodes for innocent civilian populations. Last Friday, within the context of the resumed 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly, majority of the members of this organization, through the residual rule of the Assembly, called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce, demanded of all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, and asserted the need for continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential supplies and services into the Gaza Strip. It also called for the immediate and unconditional release of all civilians held captive and demanded their safety, well-being, and humane treatment in compliance with international law. Taking into account what the Assembly has said, we must, as a Council, build upon the convergence of views on this crisis to support the Secretary General, UN agencies, and staff, including UNRWA, to deliver critical care and support services to the nearly 672,000 internally displaced persons sheltering in the 149 UNRWA facilities, as well as the many other innocent civilians who are living under desperate conditions. From recent reports of UNRWA, the number of trucks that are allowed into Gaza will need to be scaled up significantly if we are to make any impact in addressing the desperate humanitarian needs of the 2 million people in Gaza, especially in the health and food security components and the supporting supply needs. In this context, we appeal to Israel, Egypt, and other stakeholders to work constructively towards enhanced humanitarian access through the Rafah border crossing, and to all donors to step up financial and material contributions to UNRWA to meet the growing and urgent humanitarian needs of the people of Gaza. We must also use the weight of the Assembly's decision to strenuously encourage the efforts of leaders in the region, especially Qatar, as well as the ICRC, that have been at the forefront of negotiations to secure the release of all Israeli and foreign hostages, to impress upon the Hamas militia to heed the demand of the international community for the immediate and unconditional release of all captured civilians. Holding innocent civilian populations as captives is wrong and unacceptable, regardless of the motives. Mr. President, the past 23 days has also been one of blood, pain, and anguish, as we have not seen in the region in recent times. Not to make further efforts to stop the fighting would be truly tragic. We encourage regional and international leaders to act as moderating influence on the parties, to help de-escalate the conflict and prevent its further spread in the region. The impact of the conflict on women, children, and the elderly has been enormous, and we owe it to them on both sides to bring this crisis to an end. In concluding, we reiterate our condolences for all lives lost and remind the Palestinian and the Israeli people of their interwoven history and shared geography, both ancient and modern. The experiences of the past should reinforce the realization that violence cannot be the tool for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Indeed, neither the security interests of Israel nor the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people for their homeland can be secured by violence. For Ghana, and as often repeated, we hold the view that a deepened commitment to a negotiated two-state solution on the basis of the 1967 borders offers the best prospects for peace and stability in the Middle East. We hope that in furtherance of this Council's responsibilities, we can find a consensus to end this conflict, bring the parties to the table of dialogue, and help deliver a secure and assured statehood for both Israel and Palestine sooner rather than later. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Ghana for his statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. My apologies for taking the floor, but I need to respond to some comments made by the Russian permanent representative. Since the beginning of this conflict, the Russian Federation has spared no moment trying to either directly or indirectly blame the United States for this crisis. It is irresponsible. It is false that we are responsible in some way for what is going on. No state has worked harder than the United States to try to resolve this situation, and we continue to work hard to do so. This is a typical Russian narrative that has, again, no basis in fact. Russia, frankly, has no credibility. Its prevarication knows no bounds. It claims to care about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Regarding U.S. actions in Syria, we responded to attacks against U.S. personnel acting in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. I think Russia will recall the UN Charter. It has been working to drive a stake through the heart of this sacred document through everything that's been doing in Ukraine. So let me just close by saying, Mr. President, the United States will continue its efforts to do what it can to ease the situation in the region. And my hope is that Russia will step up and be a responsible player in the Security Council and work with the international community to try to bring about an end to this very, very sad situation. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. The permanent representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be brief. And taking stock of the latest comment from my American colleague as an admittance, we didn't hear a response to the question that we put to him, but I would like to put a rhetorical question to him, which I don't require an answer to because it's a rhetorical question and the answer is obvious anyway. How many times during the present crisis has the United States initiated a meeting on the humanitarian situation in Gaza? Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
By our colleagues from the United Arab Emirates and China, which we appreciate. The fact that you are with us for the third time during this month is an illustration of the commitment of Brazil at the level of the foreign minister, and I am sure with the urgency from President Lula to do everything that you can in order to bring about the end of this carnage and the tragedy that the Palestinian people are going through, particularly in the Gaza Strip. We, the Palestinian people and the state of Palestine, and our people everywhere, particularly in the Gaza Strip, and our leadership, do really appreciate this commitment, this effort that Ms. Doughton for their briefings and for their moving calls. And it is coming from people who are in the field, leading teams in the field trying to save lives of the Palestinian people. We don't only express our gratitude and appreciation for what they do, and also receive with them accepting condolences for those who have lost their lives and paid the ultimate price for trying to save the life of the Palestinian people. They are the best faces of the United Nations. They are the best among us, led by a hero by the name of Guterres, who stood outside the Rafah crossing and made his brave humanitarian call: have a peaceful ceasefire, allow humanitarian convoys to reach everywhere in the Gaza Strip to save lives, to put an end to this war, and to save hospitals, to save every institution that is providing life for our people. Those are the best faces of the United Nations. And if they are in fact the best faces, which we truly believe, and we express our gratitude to them, I believe we have to listen to everything that they have said and to listen to their important call and requests: humanitarian ceasefire and humanitarian convoys up to scale, as the Secretary General requested, of a minimum of 100 truckloads every day. If we genuinely respect their calls and what they are doing, let us not only listen closely to them, but to implement their request. And with that spirit, allow me, Mr. President, to deliver my statement. Mr. President, Dag Hammarskjöld said, and I quote, "The United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but to save us from hell." End of quotation. Gaza is now hell on earth. You've heard that not from me, you've heard it from Lazzarini and many others. Gaza is now hell on earth. Saving humanity from hell today means for the United Nations to save Palestinians in Gaza. The 2.3 million Palestinians living there are enduring suffering that no human beings should endure. They are besieged and bombed with nowhere safe to go. Again, you heard Lazzarini. He said there is no safe place in the Gaza Strip. Half the homes in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged. Gaza population is comprised of 70% of refugees. Over 1.4 million Palestinians have been forcibly displaced from their homes. Again, Mr. Lazzarini. Now, virtually all of our people in Gaza are homeless, displaced, moving from one family home to another, from a hospital to a church, from a mosque to an UNRWA school, sleeping in their cars, sleeping in the streets, and still being killed wherever they go, to convince them they will not be safe anywhere in Gaza. A leaked document prepared by the Israeli Intelligence Ministry confirms that, in fact, relocating Palestinians from Gaza to tent cities in Sinai is not a threat we imagined, but a reality Israel is trying to impose. They want to depopulate the Gaza Strip completely from the entire population and throw them in the lap of Egypt in the Sinai Desert. Over 8,000 Palestinians have been killed, including over 3,000 in the south of Gaza, where Israel has forcibly transferred hundreds of thousands of people. These staggering figures keep rising with every minute that action is delayed to stop the onslaught against our people. One figure more than any other explains the magnitude of this man-made tragedy. 3,500 Palestinian children have been killed by Israel in just 3 weeks, more than the annual number of children killed across the world's conflict zones since 2019, according to Save the Children, as my sister, the minister from United Arab Emirates, Her Excellency Lana, has alluded to. Let me repeat, 3,500 Palestinian children have been killed by Israel in just 3 weeks, more than the annual number of children killed across the world's conflict zones combined since 2019. Every 5 minutes, a Palestinian child is killed. How many more days will you wait to say enough? How many more days will you wait to say enough? Paralyzed, not acting, not carrying out your duty to maintain international peace and security and to stop that war as a derivative of that. To recognize this is a war against our children. How long will it take you to recognize that thousands of children being killed before your own eyes and you're still paralyzed? Our children who are like yours, children of God, children of light, the angels on earth. Enough darkness, enough death. Save lives of our children and all children and the children of others. Mr. President, the General Assembly representing the countries of the world adopted a resolution grounded in humanity, morality, legality, and the rejection of double standards and of any justification for the killing of innocent civilians, the siege against them, their captivity, and their forced transfer. It took a stand that we will not forsake humanity. We will not forfeit international law. The General Assembly acted. The Secretary General acted. The army of his humanitarian agencies and the heroes leading them and those who are working in implementing that message acted. And there is one important body still not acting. It is you. The General Assembly called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce. This must happen immediately. It stressed that humanitarian aid and access cannot be further delayed or obstructed and must be at levels that correspond to the immense needs created by this inhumane Israeli siege and the indiscriminate attacks it is perpetrating as we speak. Thousands more lives hang in the balance. This resolution, moral one, powerful one, in which 11 of you, members of the Security Council, voted for. 3 of you abstained. 1 voted no. This resolution must be immediately and fully implemented. If you were able to vote in the General Assembly, what is stopping you from voting here? The 11 who voted yes, the 3 who abstained, among them 4 permanent members voted yes and 1 abstention. Do what the bigger body is doing. Rise up to your responsibility and what you should do instead of dragging the paralysis, I don't know for how long, while thousands of Palestinian innocent civilians, including children, being slaughtered. The Security Council must take example of the General Assembly and its wisdom and uphold its responsibilities to put an end to this bloodshed, which constitute an affront to humanity, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and a clear and imminent danger for regional and international peace and security. I want to thank the Arab group, led by my brother, Ambassador Mahmoud of Jordan, who has demonstrated an outstanding leadership in leading our group during this very difficult month. And we salute him, and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and its foreign minister who was with us, participating in what we've accomplished together with all of you, with many of you in the General Assembly. And the OIC member states for their relentless mobilization, the countries of the Global South for their support, as well as all the countries which engaged constructively and responsibly to allow us to adopt a substantive humanitarian resolution with overwhelming support from across the globe. 121 countries versus 14. Given that 11 members of this council have voted in favor of the resolution, that 3 abstained and 1 voted against, it is clear that the text enjoys broad support and must serve as basis for a clear and unequivocal position of the Council at this critical juncture. Mr. President, 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza face death every day and every night. Save them. Save them. Look at them as human beings. You cannot look only at one side and ignore this tragic humanity completely. Wake up from revenge. Look at us as human beings. Save them. We have 2,000 people under the rubble. Allow us to find them. Save those who still can be saved, and bury in a dignified manner those who have perished. Allow the 20,000 wounded to be properly treated. Allow doctors to fix broken bodies, and God to heal wounded souls. Allow humanitarian workers, the brave ones, the heroes, to perform their life-saving duties, even as they mourn their colleagues. 64 alone among UNRWA as staff killed in Israeli attacks. Allow them to conduct their sacred mission in safety and not under the bombs. Allow hospitals to resume their work to save lives and not be transformed into morgues. Allow members of the same families who have survived to embrace each other and to mourn their loved ones who did not. Allow us to pay the tribute owed to the families wiped off the face of this earth and whose names join the long list of bereaved families etched in our collective memory. Allow people who will have homes standing to go home, and allow millions of people to start thinking once more about how to rebuild their lives despite the depths of the death, devastation, and destruction they endured, despite the indelible traumas. Treat us as human beings with the respect we deserve. We are not subhuman beings. We are not from another planet. We are exactly like each and every one of you. We are humans, human beings. Treat us in this manner with respect we deserve. Show respect for our inherent dignity, not in words, but in deeds, in action, in doing something to stop this crime against our people and our children and our women and our wounded and our sick. No one should justify our killing or find reasons to give more time to the killer. Call for an end of this assault on an entire nation. Stop the killings in the West Bank by settlers and occupation forces and the forced displacement underway there. Palestinians, as human beings, have rights that must be upheld, and they are entitled to protection, and we are entitled to be defended. Many of you talk about one narrative, about one state to defend itself. When our children are being killed, do we have the right to defend them? Do we have the right to defend our families? Do we have the right to defend our schools? Do we have the right to defend our mosques? Do we have the right to defend our churches? Do we have the right to defend our homes and our soil and our nation? Do we have rights? Or rights only the monopoly of one side? Our people have, as a people, rights that have long been denied and must now be recognized so we can all live in peace and security. No assault or war will ever end this conflict or resolve this injustice. It will only deepen and widen it. We have said time and time again, there is no military solution to this conflict. We are yet to demonstrate there is a peaceful one. And I listen to you all the time. And you tell me about the two-state solution. And you repeat it. And you repeat it. And you repeat it. But you don't tell me what single step you are willing to take in order to stop the other side from destroying the two-state solution before your eyes. Isn't it enough to wake up and say the resolution that you adopted that calls for the implementation of the two-state solution, show resolve to implement these resolutions? You are the Security Council. Are you continuing to be paralyzed, or you want to act on the advice you're giving me? You're giving the Palestinian people. Two-state solution, we accepted. Implement it. Who is stopping you from implementing it? Who is stopping you from taking steps in order to push the occupation to an end, to allow for the independence of the state of Palestine? Who is stopping you? Don't keep repeating to me, two-state solution. Tell me how you are going to defend it and how you are going to implement it, so that can our people believe you and have faith in what you are saying and respect what you call for when they see you marching toward the implementation. And whoever is standing on the path of the implementation of your will should be removed from the way so that we can see the implementation of the two-state solution based on your resolutions, based on international law, based on the terms of reference. You agreed to all these things. but you're not acting. You keep repeating them, and you think by repeating them, you did your duty. No, you have to do more. You have to take the practical steps for allowing the two-state solution to become a reality. We have said time and time again, I repeat, there is no military solution to this conflict. We are yet to demonstrate there is a peaceful one. Prove us wrong. Every minute counts. Every minute is the difference between life and death for Palestinians in Gaza. And I thank you very much, Mr. President, and I hope that there is a short period of time till the end of this, your presidency. But if by any miracle that you can have a position from the Security Council to stop this war and to allow the hundreds of trucks with humanitarian assistance to enter the Gaza Strip, we will tip our hat to you and to the Security Council members. And I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the State of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished council members, my grandfather, Chaim, was a farmer. He lived in a small village in Transylvania with his wife Bracha and their 8 beautiful children. But in the spring of 1944, the small village ceased to exist. Their community was erased. The Nazis forced Chaim, Bracha, and their children, 8 children, onto cattle cars hurtling towards Auschwitz. Upon arrival, Bracha and 7 of their children, Pearl, Tzvi, Sarah, Hodaya, Leah, Henya, and little baby Mordechai, were murdered in the gas chambers and turned to ash. My grandfather's story was once a horror story of a different era, of a distant time of unfathomable hatred, a time which, until 3 weeks ago, we referred to as never again. Yet, never again happened again. The villages in southern Israel that were invaded by Hamas terrorists were peaceful agricultural villages, just like my grandfather's village in Transylvania. Entire communities were exterminated. Only this time, the murderers were Hamas Nazis. Entire Israeli families were turned into smoke and ash, no different than the fate that my grandfather's family met in Auschwitz. But the brutality of the crimes is not the only thing that the savage Hamas Nazis share with the German Nazis. They both share a common ideology, and it's not the two-state solution. The Einsatzgruppen Nazi death squads were committed to exterminating the Jews, just as the Nukhba Hamas terrorists are committed to exterminating the Jews and Israel. The Nazis sought a Judenrein, Jew-free Europe, just as Hamas seeks a Judenrein Israel. Hamas are modern-day Nazis, from their appalling, inhumane violence to identical genocidal ideologies. Hamas is not seeking a solution to the conflict. They are not interested in dialogue. The only solution Hamas is interested in is the final solution, the annihilation of the Jewish people. And may I remind my colleague, they are the rulers of Gaza, not you. Yet Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, is no Adolf Hitler. He is not the Führer. He is not the leader of this genocidal death cult hell-bent on world domination. That role, dear colleagues, and you know it very well, is held by the supreme leader of Iran, the bloodthirsty Ayatollah Khamenei. Hitler's Third Reich was envisioned to be a 1,000-year empire stretching across continents, just as Khamenei envisions his radical Shiite hegemony to stretch across the region and beyond. The Ayatollah regime is the modern Nazi regime, and their death squads includes Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Revolutionary Guard, and other savage jihadists. Instead of shouting, Sieg Heil, these radical Nazi Islamists scream, death to Israel, death to America, death to England. You could see it on the Khamenei's Twitter account. Just like the Nazi regime, the Ayatollah regime sows death and destruction everywhere it touches. Just as the French under the Vichy or the Italian under Mussolini, the residents of Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, and Syria are enduring indescribable bloodshed and terror at the hands of Iran's jihadist Nazi forces. Like the suffering of Londoners during the Blitzkrieg, Ukrainian civilians are being murdered from the skies with Iranian Nazi weaponry. Like the ever-reaching hand of the Wehrmacht, the Houthi Iranian proxy attacked Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and Albania was struck by unprovoked Iranian cyber attacks. The Islamic Nazi regime of Iran is responsible for aiding terrorists around the globe and working towards destroying every value our civilized world holds dear. Today, the world is watching the rise of a Shia Islamist Reich. Yet, just like the rise of Nazism, the world is silent. Deafeningly silent. Even if you continue calling this meeting the situation in the Middle East and the Palestinian question for the rest of time, it will not make it any truer. This meeting is only about the situation in the Middle East and the Iranian threat. This has nothing to do with the Palestinians. 3 weeks ago, humanity witnessed Iran's Hamas death squads in action. Like Babi Yar, they exterminated Jews in the hundreds like they were insects. Hamas Nazis deliberately sliced open the pregnant belly of a woman, removed her fetus, and stabbed it before its mother's eyes while she was still alive. But even so, the Security Council still has not condemned Hamas for the intentional murder of Israeli civilians. Unbelievable. Over 250,000 innocent Israeli civilians have been displaced since the war began. Millions of Israelis are living every day under constant indiscriminate rocket fire, both in the south and the north, at the hands of Hamas, Hezbollah, and other jihadists. Does this council not have anything to say about this? Is this not also part of the situation in the Middle East? Council members, when my grandfather Chaim and his children were sent to Auschwitz, the world stayed silent. When his babies were sent to the gas chambers, the world stayed silent. When their bodies were burned along millions of other Jewish children, not only Jewish, the world was silent. Today, after innocent Jewish babies were burned alive, this council is still silent. Some member states have learned nothing in the past 80 years. Some of you have forgotten why this body was established. So I will remind you, from this day on, each time you look at me, you will remember what staying silent in the face of evil means. Just like my grandparents and the grandparents of millions of Jews, from now on, my team and I will wear yellow stars. We will wear this star until you condemn the atrocities of Hamas and demand the immediate release of our hostages. We walk with a yellow star as a symbol of pride, a reminder that we swore to fight back, to defend ourselves. Never again is now. Council members, in the face of the UN's silence, our enemies have become emboldened. They have seen the UN General Assembly applauding efforts to prevent the Jews from defending ourselves. They heard the Secretary General portray understanding for the Nazi slaughter. And this is precisely why we have seen the most staggering rise in Jew hatred since the Nuremberg laws and their aftermath. The anti-Semites have been empowered. They now know that slaughtering Jews in their beds is met with silence. They have been so galvanized by these organizations in action that they cannot wait to butcher Jews themselves. Calls for gassing the Jews are heard in Sydney. Chants for a Judenrein Palestine from the river to the sea can be heard from California to New York. Islamist battle cries against Jews are being screamed in London, Brussels, and Paris. An airport in Dagestan, Russia, was flooded yesterday by Islamist terror supporters who search for Jews to lynch. This is precisely where the world stood as the Nazis began their rampage. Precisely the same moment. And then, too, the world was silent. Understand where we are right now. Comprehend the weight of this moment. Internalize that the world stands at a crossroad just as it did in the 1930s. Would this council take the approach of Chamberlain, appease the Nazis and their sympathizers, or will this council take the approach of Churchill to fight evil with blood, toil, tears, and sweat? Israel has made its choice. We were attacked by the Hamas Nazis. We were shown that genocidal Jew hatred did not die with Hitler. It bubbled and grew until it invaded our homeland. But the difference between 1939 and today is that today Jews have a strong state and a powerful military. We are not defenseless. We are lions of Judah, and we will defend ourselves against those that seek to annihilate us. In the days leading up to and following the October 7th massacre, Simchat Torah massacre, the Führer Khamenei continued to spread his poisonous genocidal ideologies with the world. He tweeted about the end of Israel. He said that whoever normalizes relations with Israel would lose. He claimed that Israel is dying, and on the day of the massacre, he called for the eradication of Israel alongside a video of Israelis running for their lives as his Hamas Einsatzgruppen mowed them down with machine guns. Colleagues, if Hitler had a Twitter account, it would look exactly the same as Khamenei's. Exactly. Shockingly, despite the blatant genocidal Nazism of the Islamic Reich of Iran, the Secretary General and UN officials, who are being applauded here, are still meeting with Iranian officials without saying one word of condemnation for their support of genocide. What a disgrace. The Secretary General rolled out the red carpet for the Iranian Nazi foreign minister here in this very building last week, smiling and shaking his blood-soaked hand. Secretary Guterres, aside from empty words paid as lip service for media purposes, has not publicly demanded even once that ISIS-Hamas terrorists allow their